Montana Territory, 1885. The land was a white wilderness, swallowed by storm and silence. Daniel Hayes lived alone on a patch of frozen earth, where no one came, unless they were lost or dying. The wind howled like a chorus of ghosts, sweeping snow across the cabin walls until even the moon disappeared. He sat by the fire with a tin cup of coffee in his hands, staring at the flames like they were the only living thing left in the world. When the knock came, soft but desperate, Daniel thought for a second he'd imagined it. Out here, no one knocked at your door in a blizzard unless fate had led them there. When he opened it, a blast of icy wind nearly took the breath from his lungs. A young woman stood before him, her face pale, her clothes torn from the storm, and snow tangled in her hair. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling like the wind itself. "My horse." He didn't make it. Her eyes were wide, frightened but still burning with a fragile strength. Daniel didn't ask questions. He simply stepped aside, motioning her in. The door shut behind her, cutting off the storm's roar. Inside, the cabin was small, the fire warm but weak. Daniel handed her his coat, then a blanket, then poured the last of the coffee into a cup that shook in her hands. She drank slowly, her eyes darting around the cabin, the rifles above the hearth, the boots by the door, the old portrait of a woman long gone. "You can stay the night," Daniel said gruffly, as though he were doing her a favor, though deep down he knew she'd already changed the air in the room. He hadn't spoken more than a few words to another soul in weeks. The loneliness had become a part of him, as constant as the wind outside. Now there was another heartbeat in the room, and it unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. As she thawed by the fire, Daniel studied her quietly. She looked young, maybe 20, with dark hair and eyes that carried miles of sorrow. Her clothes were worn thin, the kind that belonged to travelers who'd run out of luck. "Where were you headed?" he asked finally. "West," she said softly. "To find my brother. The army took him after the raids. They said he'd be sent to a fort near Helena." She stared into the flames as she spoke, her voice cracking only once. Daniel didn't press her for more. He'd seen enough in her eyes to know that she'd already lost more than most could bear. He stirred the fire, watching the sparks rise like small stars before dying in the smoke. "Storm won't let up till morning," he muttered. "You'll stay till it clears." She nodded gratefully, her lips forming a faint smile before exhaustion pulled her eyes closed. Daniel sat across from her, elbows on his knees, listening to the wind scream against the logs. He should have felt uneasy, a stranger under his roof, the memory of his dead wife's voice still whispering in the corners of the room. But instead, there was a quiet peace. Maybe it was because for the first time in years he wasn't alone. Hours passed. The fire dimmed, then flared again as he added wood. Clara, that was her name, she had said between sips of coffee, slept curled beneath the blanket, her breathing shallow but steady. Daniel watched her like a man guarding something fragile, afraid that the storm outside might break through and take her away too. He thought about his wife, buried beneath the cottonwoods by the river. She died of fever 10 winters ago, and since then he'd lived as though nothing worth saving remained. But looking at the stranger asleep by his fire, Daniel felt a stirring he hadn't known in years, a reminder that warmth could still exist in a frozen world. Toward midnight, the wind screamed harder, shaking the cabin walls. Daniel checked the door, then the small window that let in faint glimmers of moonlight through the snow. He sat back down, pulling his coat tight. Clara stirred in her sleep, murmuring something he couldn't understand. When she woke suddenly, gasping, he was already beside her. "You're safe," he said softly. "Just a dream." She nodded, her hand clutching the edge of the blanket. For a moment, her eyes met his, full of gratitude, fear, and something else neither could name. They spoke little after that. The storm did the talking. But somewhere between the crackle of fire and the hiss of snow against wood, an unspoken understanding grew. Two strangers, both haunted by ghosts of their own, bound together by the simple need to survive the night. Daniel looked into the fire, its glow reflecting in her eyes, and for a fleeting second he saw something that almost looked like hope. The kind of hope he'd buried long ago with his past. By dawn, the storm still raged, though the light was beginning to seep through the cracks. Daniel rose quietly, poured her another cup of coffee and set it by her side. Clara stirred awake, her face soft in the dim glow. "Thank you," she whispered. He only nodded, brushing frost from his hat. The day ahead would be cold, maybe colder than the last. But somehow with her presence, it didn't feel quite so endless. The old cabin, once silent and hollow, now held the faint rhythm of two hearts beating against the storm, and as Daniel stood at the window, watching the snow drift across the land, he realized something he hadn't in years, that even in the dead of winter, the heart remembers how to feel. It just needs a knock at the door to remind it that not all warmth is lost. By morning, the storm had softened but not gone. The world outside Daniel's cabin was wrapped in white silence, every sound swallowed by snow and sky. Clara sat near the window, her shawl pulled tight, staring at the endless horizon as though she could see something beyond it. Maybe her past, maybe her future. The fire crackled softly behind her, filling the room with its amber glow. Daniel poured water into a kettle, the scrape of metal the only sound. Then her voice broke the quiet. "It's my first night alone," she said quietly, her breath fogging the glass. "Since they took my family." Her words hung in the air like frost. Daniel froze mid-motion, his hand resting on the old iron pot. He turned slowly, watching her shoulders tremble, her gaze still fixed on the snow outside. "You don't have to talk about it," he said gently. She shook her head. "If I don't, I'll forget their voices." Daniel didn't know how to answer. He'd spent years burying voices of his own, his wife's laughter, his son's first cry, all lost to fever and time. The silence had become his way of surviving. But looking at Clara, he saw how silence could also be its own kind of death. So he set down the kettle and crossed the room, kneeling beside her. "You're safe now," he said. "No one's coming for you here." His voice cracked slightly at the edges, not from age, but from the weight of remembering how to care. She looked at him then, really looked, and for a long moment the storm outside didn't exist. There was only the warmth of the fire and two people who had outlived too much. "You don't even know me," she whispered. Daniel managed a faint smile. "Don't need to. Folks like us, we've both been left behind by the same world." He stood and tossed another log into the fire, the sparks rising like fleeting stars. The days passed slow but steady. The snow began to melt from the rooftops, trickling down like silver threads. Daniel taught Clara how to tend the fire, how to mend the fences when the thaw came, and how to ride his old mare once her hands stopped shaking. In return, she cooked, cleaned, and filled the cabin with a quiet presence that made it feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Sometimes they talked late into the night, about her brother, about his wife, about the strange way life kept taking everything and still expecting you to keep living. One evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of whiskey, Clara stood by the fire, brushing her hair loose from its braids. Daniel watched her from the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. "You should rest," he said softly. She smiled, the kind of smile that came not from happiness, but from gratitude. "You've already given me more rest than I've had in months," she said. The firelight danced across her face, catching the faint curve of a tear she quickly brushed away. Outside, the snow melted into mud, and the first buds of spring began to appear along the creek. With each passing day, Daniel found himself waking earlier, listening for her footsteps, waiting for her voice. The loneliness that had once been a constant ache now felt like a memory, fading into distance. Sometimes he caught himself humming as he chopped wood, or talking to the horses again like he used to. Only now there was laughter behind it. But peace, like spring, was fragile in the frontier. One night near the end of March, Clara woke to the sound of horses in the distance, faint, rhythmic, urgent. Daniel was already by the window, his rifle in hand. "Riders," he said. "Can't see who." Fear flickered in Clara's eyes, and he saw it immediately. "Could be them," she whispered. "The soldiers." He turned toward her. "You stay here," he ordered quietly. "No one's taking you again." The riders passed without stopping, just travelers moving west under the moonlight. But that night changed something. When the danger faded, Daniel found Clara outside, standing barefoot in the snowmelt, her hands trembling. "You should be inside," he said, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. She shook her head, tears glinting in the faint light. "I thought it was over," she whispered. "I thought I could forget." He held her then, not like a stranger, not like a savior, but like someone who finally understood her pain because he'd carried the same kind himself. As the days grew longer, the world turned green again. Grass pushed through the frost, the river swelled, and the mountains shed their white coats. Life had returned to the land, and to them. Daniel would catch Clara humming as she hung clothes on the line, or whispering small prayers to the wind. He never interrupted. He just watched, letting the sound of her voice fill all the empty spaces time had left behind. One evening, as the sun melted into gold behind the mountains, Daniel sat by the fire sharpening his knife when Clara spoke. "When the snow melted," she said softly, "I thought I'd leave. Keep searching for my brother." He didn't look up. "And now?" She hesitated. "Now I don't know. Maybe I found what I was looking for." He set the knife down slowly, meeting her eyes. "If you go, I won't stop you," he said. "But if you stay, there'll always be a place here for you." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire popped, a log collapsed into embers, and the scent of wood smoke filled the air. Then Clara crossed the room, her steps quiet against the wooden floor. She stopped in front of him and whispered, "I think I'll stay." That night Daniel didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, watching it fade to ash, his heart both heavy and light. Outside, the last traces of winter disappeared under the promise of spring. The world had turned, and somehow he had too. Weeks later, when the first wildflowers bloomed near the river, Clara planted a small garden by the cabin. She said it was for the ones they'd lost, her family, his wife, but Daniel knew better. It was for the living. It was for hope. By summer, the cabin no longer looked like the home of a lonely man. The window glowed at night, and laughter sometimes drifted out into the quiet valley. Daniel still rode out at dawn to check his fences, but now, when he came back, someone waited for him. Someone who turned the sound of his boots on the porch into something that felt like belonging. He never spoke of love, and neither did she. They didn't need to. Some promises are made in words. Others are made in firelight, when the world outside is cold and two souls find warmth in each other's silence. And in that small cabin beneath the Montana sky, a widowed cowboy and a lost girl learned what it truly meant to be found. Daniel often said that the winter of '85 was the coldest he'd ever lived through, but also the one that saved him. Because sometimes, when the storm brings someone to your door, it isn't chance, it's mercy. And mercy, he learned, can sound a lot like a knock in the middle of the night.